All right, go ahead and turn to Acts chapter 2. We're continuing our series in the book of Acts that we started with the new year. You'll recall the first week we looked at the beginning of time when Jesus was commissioning his disciples and the church together. And what he was doing is he was telling them is that there is going to be a Holy Spirit that is going to come and give you power, and you shall, having been empowered by that Spirit, by my Spirit, be my witnesses both at home and in your areas and throughout the earth, even to the ends of the earth. And then he instructed them at that time that they were supposed to go to Jerusalem. Remember, these were at that time 11 Galilean men that were called to wait in Jerusalem until the promise of the Holy Spirit comes to them. And in Acts chapter 1, verse 9, Jesus ascends into heaven. Following that, 120 of his very first followers go to the upper room where they await the promise of the Holy Spirit. This 120 included 11 of the remaining apostles after the death of Judas. It also included Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the rest of the followers, 120 in a world of 100 million people. So in that room, 11 were apostles, 109 were not, and they went through the process of casting lots to identify who it was that was going to take the place of Judas in their apostolic band. They cast lots. The lots fell to Matthias. And as we saw last week, this is the last time throughout the biblical narrative where we see the casting of lots used to demonstrate the will of God. And we know why that is, and that why is because the Holy Spirit is going to come. And this morning we're going to see the Holy Spirit come in an extraordinary and overwhelming and fascinating way. So let's go to Acts chapter 2, and we'll be looking at the first 13 verses together this morning. When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire appeared to them and rested on each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. And they were amazed and astonished, saying, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in his own native language? Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians. We hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God." And all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others mocking said, "They are filled with new wine." This is the word of the Lord. When the day of Pentecost arrived. Pentecost simply means 50. It's the feast that comes after Passover in the Jewish tradition. You'll recall that when the Israelites made their exodus from Israel, that was the time, from Egypt, that's when they would celebrate the Passover. And then 50 days later, on Mount Sinai, God gives Moses the law. And they began celebrating what they called the Feast of Weeks. That would be on that 50th day following the Passover, where they would celebrate the provision of God's law to God's people on Mount Sinai. So think about this. You had the Passover that happens. That's when the events of Jesus' death, burial, resurrection take place. Then we have 40 days in which he appears to more than 500 witnesses. And then on day 40, he ascends into heaven in Acts 1:9. For 10 days, the disciples wait in the upper room for the Holy Spirit to come upon them. And then day 50, the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit comes. So just kind of putting this narrative in perspective, we are now 50 days, basically, roughly, after the resurrection. A lot's happened in their life, hasn't it? These were Galilean fishermen, a tax collector, a zealot trying to overthrow the Roman government, who all abandoned everything that was familiar to them, everything they knew, everything they were, everything that expressed their identity, everything they understood about themselves and their world, and they followed a carpenter from Nazareth who proclaimed that he was there to fulfill the will of God, that he was the Messiah, that he was the promised one. And sometimes you sit here and you look at that and you think, would I have done that? Because it's not logical, is it? Why would you ever leave the comfort of everything you knew to follow a Galilean carpenter? Why? Because there is a way that the Spirit of God has been working since the Spirit of God was hovering on the waters when God created the world, through the power of that Spirit. And that Spirit worked in those 12 people. He worked in the other 108 that were in that room, and He works in your life, and He works in my life too. And that's what we celebrate here today, is the fact that we try to do things based solely upon our own logic, solely upon our own understanding, based